Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started on the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me so I can approve one way or another. The subject from this particular episode was chosen by me. If you'd still like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-Podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast wherever that you might listen to it. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the documentary Remember the Sultana, the History Channel documentary on the Sultana, the Part-Time Explorer episode on the Sultana, an Atlas Obscura article on the Sultana Memorial in Knoxville, Tennessee, the National Park Service's page on Appomattox Courthouse, the American Battlefield Trust page on the Sultana disaster, the Sultana Disaster Museum website, a Toledo Blade article titled The Sinking of the Sultana, and Sultana Surviving the Civil War, Prison, and the Worst Maritime Disaster in America by Alan Huffman. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 260, the SS Sultana Disaster. April 27th, 1865. Over 1,100 deceased, 760 injured. We all know what it's like to go home after a long time away. Whether it's because of work, school, prison, or something else which swallows up your life just enough, that first time back home in a good long while is a little more exciting with every mile closer that you get. And that's under good conditions. Everybody's happy, everybody's healthy, you're bringing home a new partner no one's met, or a baby the rest of the family hasn't gotten to see in person. Sometimes the circumstances are far worse. In April of 1865, hundreds of soldiers who'd spent months and possibly years as prisoners of war in some of the worst Civil War camps started the long trek to the northern states they called home. The hundreds who boarded the ill-fated SS Sultana would never make it back. The American Civil War began on April 12th, 1861, when Confederate soldiers from South Carolina fired the first shots at Fort Sumter, an island fortress a sandbar away from the South Carolina coastline. What followed was 4 years of fighting, shooting, blowing stuff up, racial rights tug of war, and the deaths of 500,000 American citizens before the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. The lucky soldiers on either side survived without serious injury or capture and made their way home at the end of the war with only whatever mental and physical scars they might have suffered along the way. I say only, that is a lot, but still, it could be worse. The unlucky died somewhere far from home in the middle of a battlefield littered with broken bodies, or were taken on as prisoners of war. Prisoners of war were handy. You could trade them for soldiers of your own that the opposing side were holding on to. You might need those soldiers considering how many were falling dead in the field of war. Every man could be useful. At the beginning of the war, prisoner exchanges were done pretty quickly. You could be a prisoner of war only a few short hours and back to fighting with your side by the next day. But as the war progressed, trading of prisoners became more complicated, and those quickie releases stopped happening. See, whether or not you needed to hand back a useful soldier depended on what you defined as useful. Once prisoners of war began to be kept for longer amounts of time, you needed somewhere to keep them. The Confederacy kept their prisoners of war in places like Cahaba in Alabama or the notorious Andersonville in Georgia. Andersonville existed for a mere 14 months from February of 1864 until April of 1865, and over the course of those months held about 45,000 Union prisoners. 13,000 of those would die during that time, and for good reason. By modern estimations, Andersonville could arguably be called a concentration camp on a level with some of the sites the Nazis built. Imagine, if you will, a fort with high log walls, the interior 26.5 acres of open land crowded with tents or like tarps over holes in the ground. Tens of thousands of men crowded into a site the size of Ellis Island, making it technically the 5th largest Confederate city. You were surrounded by your compatriots on muddy grounds, the latrines a festering disease generator, the food barely enough to keep a dog alive, much less a fully grown man. Men dropped weight until they were skeletal. You didn't have to worry about dying of dysentery on the Oregon Trail when you could do it confined to a stifling, stinking, swampy pit in the middle of a Georgia summer. Those men who'd ended up at Cahaba weren't much better off. Their 3,000 men were crammed into a space the size of 1.5 hockey rinks, barely housed near a riverbank in a cotton warehouse that hadn't been completed. They slept in bunks almost identical to the uncomfortable wooden structures later seen in places like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. They, too, suffered from the same deprivations as those in Andersonville: lack of food, clean water, medicine, decent shelter. The Confederacy only had so many supplies, and they certainly weren't going to waste them on prisoners of war before they gave them to their own soldiers or people living in Confederate states who were facing all sorts of, boycotts and all kinds of things to impede their ability to get the things that they needed to get by. Blockades and that sort of thing. Being taken as a prisoner of war meant losing all of your possessions. They basically shook you down before you went in and took everything that you had, aside from, your clothes. So you needed to make do with what you found, could get, or were given in whichever camp you ended up at. It really depended which camp you were at and who was in charge. Cahaba especially had two people that were in charge. The person who was the top man, who was a Methodist minister, I believe his name was Henderson. He was a Methodist minister. He was a very good person. He treated the prisoners of war as well as he could. And then his person who was underneath him, that person treated them terribly. And so you kind of hoped that if you had to deal with anybody at that camp, it was the guy in charge, because he was the one who was willing to, try and get people, clean clothes and food and everything that they needed. You weren't going to be handed gardening equipment. You're not going to be able to barter for a water filtration system. You're not going to order anything from Amazon. This is not that. You are stuck in a prisoner of war camp that is just, there's nothing. There's no apple trees to pick. There's no livestock. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. In the case of, I think it was Cahaba, they were basically giving you cornmeal and water, and you had to go from there. And people could get inventive. With the cornmeal and water, they were getting barrels. And if you get a barrel, you can take the cornmeal and the water and make something like ale, something like beer. So yeah, that was one of the inventive things that you could do. And people did get inventive. They did things like carving tools, whether they needed a spade to dig, or if they needed scissors to cut people's hair. Yeah, there were all kinds of people who were soldiers now who had been doing other jobs prior to the war, who came in with talents that they could use, that they could barter for food or money. There was something like, I think, $40,000 that was circulating around in Cahaba that was going from like one person to another, because you're paying for a haircut, and then the person who pays for a haircut goes and buys a cup of beer, and then, you know, the person who's running the beer barrel, goes and pays to get a new shirt. Like, it was that kind of a thing. There were people constructing makeshift shelters. I think it was specifically Cahaba, but it may also have been the sort of thing that happened at Andersonville too, where they were building these things called shebangs. And it was like I described before, where it was a hole in the ground, and you basically just took a tarp over it, and now you have not a tent, obviously, but you have this shelter, basically. Then there were people who lived near the camps that you could befriend. Some of them were at least trying to be kind to the people who were prisoners of war. There's one woman who's talked about in the book Sultana, Surviving the Civil War. I believe her name was Amanda Graham, but she was a neighbor. And she was a Confederate. She had, a son or two that was fighting in the war. And still, she turned around and would slip books through the fence. She would, give them clothes or like old rags if they needed like, something to cover themselves with at night, like a blanket. She did that for a while. She got away with it. But the thing is that when you do things like that, it does come back to you. Later on, her son was captured by Union forces, and they actually let him go because they had heard about how kind she had been to people in in Cahaba. No matter how many ways you'd managed to adapt, however, you were still struggling most days to find something to eat, subsisting off cornmeal and dirty water, and dropping pounds on the world's worst diet. You were wearing a Union uniform that wasn't getting sent to the dry cleaners once a week. Every disgusting thing you were encountering on a daily basis was getting ground into that fabric on a daily basis. At Cahaba, there were 6 privy holes for 3,000 prisoners. So you can imagine the stink emanating from that. Not only that, if there are only 6 toilets for 3,000 people, there's going to be people who just decide, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I am going to go over here. I'm just going to dig a hole, use that, and then cover it back up again. If you're urinating, it's one thing. If you're doing anything else, you're going to need to bury that. But the problem with that, along with so many other things that were going on in Cahaba and Andersonville, is that it just generates like bugs, lice, maggots. Like you would go into these shebangs, those little shelters in the ground at night, and you'd just be crawling with all of this. Then there were the gangs. Gangs of prisoners formed, groups of prisoners formed gangs to rob the others, stealing whatever they could from other prisoners who didn't have the strength to fight back. They would try to make, like, groups that would police the prisoner of war camp, that would gather together and make sure that the gangs couldn't do this sort of thing because they didn't have power in numbers against something like that. But what would end up happening is, somebody ends up getting dispatched, traded to another prisoner of war camp, or maybe sent back. Again, that wasn't happening a lot, the being sent back at a certain point, not the least of which because the Confederates, for obvious reasons, were not seeing black soldiers, Union soldiers, as equivalent to a white soldier of the same rank and all of that. So they weren't willing to trade for them, and it was just another thing, another reason for them not to trade back prisoners of war at a certain point. In the spring of 1865, the prison at Cahaba flooded. Men who were already surviving solely on cornmeal now found themselves up to their knees, or higher, in floodwaters carrying all of the terrible body-wrecking diseases you'd expect. Cahaba had already been ordered to be closed a year earlier because of the awful water situation, but despite initial transfers of a lot of the population to other POW camps, it stayed open. So the prisoners paid the price when the water supply essentially took over the camp. This whole camp is just like flooded. Almost the whole thing. It started at one end and it just kind of went up because I guess it was on a kind of hillside, I guess, the way it's described. So, it's a little bit of a slope. But yeah, what ended up happening with Cahaba was they were supposed to be sending people out. They started just sending them to like Andersonville and other places. And they still had some people at Cahaba. And then they just kind of forgot about it. And they just started adding people back to Cahaba again. And now when this happens, there's thousands of people in Cahaba. And they are... and by the way, if I'm mispronouncing Cahaba, I apologize. I was sure that it's Cahaba. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I'm saying it right. Anyway, the people who were there were very much, having to deal with all of this mess. Andersonville was not much, not much better. I mean, there are horror stories about Andersonville. If you ever hear anything about Andersonville, it's not good. It is nightmarish. These were men that, for sensible reasons, considering the war, the Union was not willing to trade for. For moral reasons, they might, but for practical reasons, taking back a man who dropped down to 90 pounds and was riddled with vitamin deficiencies and diarrhea wasn't worth the time it would take to rehabilitate them. This meant by the time it was clear the Confederacy was heading toward losing the war in the spring of 1865, thousands of men had spent months living in the unmitigated hell of Cahaba and Andersonville, where the death rate was 10 times that of the battlefield. Because of the flooding of Cahaba in March 1865, the Confederates decided the best decision to make at this point was to move many of their prisoners to Camp Fisk, a parole camp in Vicksburg, Mississippi. On March 20th, prisoners started to be loaded onto trains. Hundreds and thousands of weak, painfully skinny men crowded into boxcars in a visual which would be repeated in another country in 75 years or so. The trains wouldn't make it all the way, which meant ill or starved prisoners struggling to walk the rest of the way to Vicksburg. Some of them would never make it. Part of the reason that they started sending them to Vicksburg was because it was pretty clear the war's almost over. They're going to have to parole these guys anyway. Let's just get them to Camp Fisk, and then when they're ready to be paroled, we will be in a position to send them back, as in by the river, by the Mississippi River. So they have to start sending them to Vicksburg and to Camp Fisk, but to do so, they're trying to use railroads. Railroads, just like, all sorts of infrastructure, they fail during wars, and they don't get a chance to get rebuilt, especially during a civil war like this. The, telegraph lines, railroad lines, dams, you just couldn't depend on their safety during this time. And so with these prisoners, they were getting a ride as far as they could, and then they kind of had to walk, which you have to imagine people who had been in the concentration camps in Europe in the 40s trying to walk out. They wouldn't have gotten far. And the fact that some of these soldiers died on the way to Camp Fisk is not a surprise. Camp Fisk would take in thousands of Union prisoners of war in March of 1865, nearly all of them in appalling health. They needed rest and food. Going to Camp Fisk wasn't luxurious, but had way fewer downsides compared to the nightmares of Cahaba and Andersonville. Wasn't fancy, but it was definitely better than that. It was one step closer to freedom and to going back home to the north. The weather was better, the food was better, the medical treatment was better. Prisoners started healing, slowly gaining weight, allowing their hope to grow. They were so close to freedom at this point, they could almost taste it. In Cahaba and in Andersonville, you might get some medicine, and if you got serious enough, they might take you out for some hospital treatment, depending on your rank as well. In regards to officers, sometimes they were allowed to stay in town and allowed the freedom to walk around as long as they didn't leave. But with the enlisted men, they were stuck in these camps, and they were just having to, survive as best they could. So getting to Camp Fisk, some of these people needed to be taken to the nearest hospital in Vicksburg to be, examined, to be fixed. Maybe they had broken arms or infected wounds or whatever that needed to be taken care of. And so that was part of it, was being able to go and get that taken care of. Very different from when they were in the camps, when oftentimes people would be just dying in those shebangs and just left there. There's a story in the book Sultana, Surviving the Civil War, etc., where the author talks about how there was he quotes somebody who was in, I believe, Cahaba, who said that there was a person who was close to death, and they were in their shebang, and every day they would go and they would peek in there and check in on them, and they were just covered from like head to toe in all kinds of vermin, and they're still alive. They were still breathing. They were still there, and they just kind of would cover them up and keep going and figure, well, we'll come again tomorrow, and they'll be gone. And this took like a week and a half before they finally passed away, and they were just like that. So really traumatizing. The change to Camp Fisk, where again, it is not the Waldorf Astoria. It is a camp with tents. It is still not Cahaba, and it is not Andersonville. So it is a step up. When the prisoners from Cahaba arrived at Camp Fisk, it was right at the start of April 1865, a notably crowded time for important events in American history. Of course, they wouldn't know that at the time. They were focused on getting better, on going home. The end of the war, which would surely come soon, was their green light. Sure enough, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and Union General Ulysses S. Grant would arrive at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Now, Appomattox Courthouse was the name of the town, not the building where they would meet, which would actually be in the parlor of local Wilmer McLean's family home. Over the course of a couple of hours that afternoon, Lee and Grant almost cordially resolved the surrender of the Confederacy and the end to the American Civil War. I say cordially. I mean, they were like, they had some chit-chat, they filled out all the paperwork, took them a couple of hours. I think it was Robert E. Lee goes to leave, and they kind of, very nice. Oh, we'll see you later. Like it was just, you read this description that is on the National Park Service site about Appomattox Courthouse, and it just makes it sound like it was just the nicest little tea party, instead of the end of a brutal war that killed, so many Americans. Telegraphy had been an important tool for the North during the war, especially given their setup was so strong and widespread, and the telegraph system in the South was, well, not. And let's not even get into war would have impacted how war would have impacted the mail service. Suffice it to say, unlike now when breaking news breaks on your phone pretty much the moment it happens, in April of 1865, any news you received was already probably 3 or 4 days old, and you were grateful to even get that much. So it took 4 days before those at Camp Fisk learned about the end of the war. Finding out about the Confederate surrender, they cheered. They had like a 100-gun salute. They had like a party. It was, yay, it's over. It's all over. You completely understand why they were so excited. As I mentioned, one effect of Union and Confederate troops tearing through the country over the previous 4 years was that many of the country's railways were also destroyed by troop interference. Want to cut off supply systems? Blowing up or tearing apart a rail line left folks with no other access when they needed to get things where they needed to go, and fast. It's a necessary tool in the fog of war. But once that fog clears and the war ends, now those broken rail lines are preventing troops from returning home on the fastest mode of transportation available at the time. There were some rail lines still running, but in a lot of cases, train rides would only go on so far before the rails would be broken, or warped, or just not there. It was basically, you were taking the risk. If you were going to be taking a train, it was inevitably, in the South, it was inevitably going to get to a point where it would stop and you would have to, walk ahead or something along those lines. But you really wanted a direct line, but as it was, you were going to have to walk all the way back to the north. There's walking, of course, but that would take the longest, and carts and wagons could only make up so much of that travel time. There was another option, however: marine travel. For those going back to the Northeast, the easiest way to get home would be loading up Union soldiers on boats and sending them up along the Atlantic coast. So if you were in, from New Hampshire or Maine or something along those lines, they just throw you on a boat and send you up the coast and get you there that way. Those headed back to states more to the Midwest, like Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, however, would need to be taken home another way. Between the Mississippi River, its tributaries, and the other large rivers accessible from there, a tired, hungry soldier could travel almost all the way back home on the water right into the arms of his loving family. Steamships, barges, fishing boats, the easiest way to get back home at the end of the war was on the water. Enter the SS Sultana. Constructed in Ohio in 1862 and launched out of the Lutherburg shipyards in Cincinnati at the beginning of 1863. A former steamboat captain named Preston Lodwick commissioned the building of the Sultana for $80,000, which would be just over $3 million in today's money. I did see reference to it being $60,000. Like, it was about that much. Keep in mind, it was that range of $60,000 to $80,000. I would say about $2.5 million to $3 million, give or take. And he also commissioned another one at the same time, but that one's not important to our story. So this wasn't the first Sultana by any means. There'd been 4 of them prior to the construction of this one, all of which had been tragically lost in accidents, which is the disaster equivalent of deciding what the American airspace needs is another Flight 191, considering 6 American plane accidents with similarly numbered flights have killed 428 people. As a wooden side paddle steamer with its tall pair of smokestacks towering over the decks, the Sultana would travel along Midwestern rivers, including the Mississippi, with a stated capacity of 1,000 tons, 80 crew members, and 376 passengers. The Sultana had 3 decks, and it measured 260 feet, or 79.2 meters long, and 42 feet, or 12.8 meters wide. Its 34-foot-high wheels powered a flat-hulled boat with a draft of only 5 feet below the waterline. It contained 70 staterooms for its first-class passengers and had plenty of space for passengers who didn't pay for a room and simply spent their time on deck. Now, I just want to say, I say first-class passengers. What you were getting was a cabin that was about 8 feet by 8 feet. It had 2 doors. One door went into the cabin, which the saloon area, the interior, and the other one went out into the deck. So that is your first class room, is that little area with a very small bed in it. It's not much, but it's presumably better than sitting out on the deck taking the ride up the river. I'm sure if you're only taking the ride up the river a few hours or over the course of the day, you don't really need a room, but if you were going to take it for much longer, then the room kind of is necessary. For about $12, or around $383 in today's money, you could get yourself a berth in the finest room on board the Sultana to go round trip between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Wheeling, West Virginia on the Ohio River. It would travel at around 10 miles per hour on average, chugging along the river just like several thousand others working at that time. But that tally of steamboats operating during the chaotic years of the Civil War would change constantly. For one thing, as was mentioned during the episode on the fire aboard the General Slocum decades after the events of this episode, steamboats were accident-prone. They caught fire, like the General Slocum, because they were wooden, and then they proceeded to stain everything in flammable materials. They hit things, they sank, they blew up. With such an unlucky mode of transportation, you kind of want the industry to be regulated for safety's sake, so you don't die on the way to visit Grandma in Columbus. The problem is that war can be distracting and preoccupying, particularly a civil war. Priorities change. Resources need to be directed elsewhere. So regulatory organizations weren't exactly on top of their game. This is also, by the way, in the middle of the United States at a time when that was still frontier country. So that's another reason why a lot of this was not getting regulated. Things were, or being looked over to check for any sort of problems. The military certainly weren't enforcing the sort of restrictions and punishments they might otherwise do during peacetime when it came to safety concerns regarding steamboats. Is it floating? Is it not on fire? Great. Let's load it up with supplies and men and push it on down the river. Military necessity required existence first, and safety if you could get around to it. The Sultana was one of many steamboats on the Mississippi pressed into assisting the military during the war. For the Sultana, it wasn't a full-time gig. Sometimes it would transport passengers and sometimes troops and supplies. Being contracted by the government had its ups and downs, and one of those ups was that the steamboat owners could make bank. Steamboat regulations weren't the only aspect of government falling by the wayside as war occupied the collective American mind. Another was in monitoring the health of the nation's dams and levees. Over the years, the Civil War had torn apart the country. It had also done serious damage to the structures which held our waterways in check. And if battles and armies didn't damage them, neglect and bad weather didn't help either. Flooding was rampant on the Mississippi. By the spring of 1865, the Mississippi was engorged with winter runoff, its flow strong and wild. There was so much water in the Mississippi at the time. It was just spread out. It's covering land going in like a mile or two inland. It is flooding areas so that there are trees sticking out of the water just randomly. It was very swollen and very wide and very fast in a lot of places. The man in charge of organizing the resulting floating potential tragedy featured in this episode was Captain J. Cass Mason. Mason had an excellent reputation in terms of knowledge and ability when it came to captaining a vessel like the Sultana. But Mason wasn't just a captain, he was also a part owner in the Sultana. Given the war and the fat military contracts that came with it, that meant Mason wouldn't just stay employed when the Sultana was contracted out by the government, he'd also make some extra cash in the process. He was actually one of a group of owners who got together and bought the Sultana from, I think, Preston Ludwig. He sold that, and then I think they were the next buyers. But J. Cass Mason, like a lot of other captains, was part owner in his ship. And so he was really trying to make good on, this ship, this boat, the Sultana, having a great reputation. That a possibility of being able to make some extra money gave him an incentive to accept work from whichever side would contract out to the Sultana, the Union or the Confederacy. He did not pick one side or the other. He was just doing his job. He and the crew of the Sultana delivered, and they delivered in the least amount at the very least on time, if not early. He drove the Sultana to break speed records on the Mississippi multiple times. He placed a pair of elk antlers on top of the Sultana to crown it as the fastest boat on the river. That's the guy you wanted to hire to transport what you hired him to transport to make sure it would get there as soon as possible. At about the same time as the Sultana was being inspected in St. Louis for what would be its final trip, the former prisoners of war in Vicksburg were patiently waiting their release and transport up the river. Technically, they needed to be signed off, and as soon as the war was announced to have been ended, there was a little ceremony. They got together, they signed papers, and everybody was officially released. But to be released from the military, they had to be sent up the river and then go to Camp Chase in Ohio so that they could be mustered out and head back to their homes. As soldiers, they were more like cargo than passengers for these transport trips of the river. Officers might be able to snare a spot to rest their heads in the saloon or in the cabin, in the interior, but most soldiers would have to bunk where they could, elbowing for space with the men crammed on either side of them on the decks. It would be uncomfortable, but it would be leagues better than what they went through in places like Andersonville. Soon, news spread of a shocking and devastating nature. On the evening of April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd attended a showing of the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. He was supposed to go with General and future President Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, but Grant made other plans, and instead the Lincolns showed up to share their private box seats with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. Our American Cousin was a comedy about a rude American cousin going to visit his rich, entitled British family members, and it was known to be quite the entertaining farce with some solid laugh lines. It was during one of these laugh lines, which sounds ridiculous if you ever read it, when the president, the others in his box, and the hundreds of others in the theater were chuckling, that a man walked into the president's box. There was no guard outside of it at the time. That man fired a single shot into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Major Rathbone immediately attempted to subdue the attacker, only to be stabbed himself. The assassin then leapt down onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process. After shouting something which many understood to be sic semper tyrannis, or thus also to tyrants, I believe it is. The assassin escaped out the back of the stage, clearly knowing his way around Ford's Theater. Lincoln, meanwhile, was clearly not well. He was carried across the street to the home of a tailor named William Peterson, where doctors who'd been attending the play tended to him throughout the night. As Mary Todd Lincoln sobbed over her dying husband, doctors probed the gunshot wound behind his left ear, removing clots which helped prolong his life just a few hours longer. But it was only a short-term solution. Just as morning broke on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died of his devastating wound, cementing his legacy as one of the country's greatest presidents. The death of the president was already difficult enough to face following the end of the war, but now that diabolical assassin had disappeared into the night, and the search was on for Lincoln's murderer. While the contemporary restrictions of transportation meant he couldn't have boarded a plane and disappeared to somewhere else around the globe, he certainly wasn't in custody. And in a war-ravaged America that hadn't even begun to rebuild, the assassin could vanish. But it would turn out that couldn't last forever. Most importantly of all, because of who he was. One thing was for certain, he definitely wasn't on the Sultana or at Camp Fisk. All anyone could do was wait for word to filter back to them that the president's killer had been caught, dead or alive. But life went on, and as it stood for the former prisoners of war at Camp Fisk, that meant boarding a steamboat and traveling up the river back to the north. A large number of them headed for Camp Chase, not far from Columbus. Okay, I'm going to stop this particular episode here. We're going to get to the day that everything goes absolutely terribly wrong. But because this episode is going to go out on the main feed today on New Year's Eve, I just wanted to say that I hope that everybody has a really good New Year, and hopefully next year will be better. I have been saying that for 10 years at this point. It's not working. But we need a good one. So fingers crossed. Watch something that will make you feel better. If listening to the podcast doesn't make you feel better, watch The Heated Rivalry. It'll make you happy. Makes me happy. Watch Taskmaster. That always makes me happy. But I am going to move on to the second episode, recording that. And for those of you who are on Patreon, you will be able to listen to the second episode right after this one. And those of you who are listening on the main feed will be able to listen to it next week. So for those of you who will have to wait, until next time, stay safe.